Did you know the flood walls New Orleans built after Hurricane Katrina at a cost of $15 billion are themselves sinking back into the ground at nearly 2 inches a year? Or that the French Quarter, the most photographed neighborhood in America, burned to the ground twice in the 1700s and was rebuilt almost entirely by Spain, not France? Or that in 1891, a mob of thousands broke into a city jail in New Orleans and claimed 11 lives over a crime the city never actually solved and didn't apologize for it until 2019. New Orleans sits at the center of American disaster, American denial, and American invention, all happening on the same few miles of unstable ground. Most people come here for 3 days, eat well, and leave thinking they understand the place. Nobody stays long enough to notice that the ground beneath them is still moving, and that the city has been quietly moving its problems onto someone else for 3 centuries. So settle in, because we're counting down 18 facts about New Orleans that will change how you see the city they call the city that care forgot. Stick around to the very end, because what we saved for last is documented, devastating, and unresolved. In 1891, a mob dragged 11 men out of a city jail and took their lives over a crime whose actual culprit New Orleans never identified. It is still the largest single mass lynching in American history, and the city waited 128 years to say it was sorry. Coming in at number 18, the wall that's already losing. Here's what nobody taught you about the system that's supposed to protect this city. Researchers at Tulane University used satellite radar to track the ground across greater New Orleans from 2002 to 2020 and published their findings in the journal Science Advances. Some neighborhoods, some wetlands, and some sections of the very flood walls built after Hurricane Katrina are sinking by up to 47 millimeters a year, nearly 2 inches, faster than the seas are rising around them. The United States Army Corps of Engineers is already planning upgrades through 2073 just to keep pace. New Orleans spent $15 billion building a wall to stop the water. Nobody told you the wall is going under with everything else. It's happening tonight, measured by satellite, whether anyone in the city is watching or not. Landing at number 17, the quarter that isn't French. Here's what Hollywood never told you about the most photographed street grid in the country. On March 21, 1788, a fire destroyed 856 buildings in New Orleans. 6 years later, a second fire took 212 more. Louisiana was a Spanish colony at the time, and Spain rebuilt almost everything that burned. The Cabildo, the Presbytere, and St. Louis Cathedral all went up under Spanish governors, with Spanish brick and Spanish ironwork, according to the historic New Orleans collection and the Louisiana State Museum, which now operates 2 of those buildings as public museums. Only one structure from French rule survived both fires, the old Ursuline convent, completed in 1752. Hollywood calls it the French Quarter. The record calls it a Spanish rebuild that kept a French nickname. At number 16, the room where America doubled overnight, that same Spanish-built Cabildo, the one Spain razed after the second fire, is where France formally transferred the entire Louisiana territory to the United States on December 20th, 1803, for roughly $15 million, according to the Louisiana State Museum and the National Park Service's Jean Lafitte National Historical Park. One signing, inside one room that Spain happened to build by accident, added more land to this country than the original 13 colonies combined. The room is open to the public today. Most Americans put the Louisiana Purchase in a textbook. New Orleans keeps the actual room. Fact 15, the bridge with no end. The Lake Pontchartrain Causeway runs 23.87 miles between Metairie and Mandeville, and for a long stretch of the drive, there is no land visible in any direction at all. It holds the Guinness World Record for longest continuous bridge over water, and the American Society of Civil Engineers named it a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark in 2013. Nearly 9,500 concrete pilings hold it up, and it survived Hurricane Katrina with only minor damage, while nearby bridges were destroyed outright. It survived the worst storm in the city's modern history better than almost anything else in the region, and most people who've heard of New Orleans have never heard its name. Coming in at number 14, the bridge nobody told you to watch. Every summer, roughly mid-June through mid-July, hundreds of thousands of purple martins gather underneath that same causeway to roost before flying south to South America. University of New Orleans biologist Dr. Peter Yawkey, surveying the roost for the Orleans Audubon Society, estimated a single night's gathering at approximately 250,000 birds, a number confirmed against weather radar imagery developed in partnership with the University of Oklahoma. At dawn, when they disperse, the roost shows up on radar as a distinct, expanding ring. Almost nobody outside Louisiana has been told that one of the largest bird gatherings in North America happens underneath a toll bridge, every summer on schedule. Landing at number 13, the drink the city half admits to. New Orleans apothecary Antoine Amédée Peychaud is widely credited with mixing the Sazerac, often called the first true American cocktail, at his French Quarter pharmacy, using his own aromatic bitters, which are still bottled and sold today as Peychaud's Bitters. According to the historic New Orleans collection and the Sazerac House Museum on Magazine Street, New Orleans invented an entire category of drink and gets a footnote for it most years. This channel relates that if you've made it this far, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, which is more than New Orleans can say about flood insurance. Fact 12, the myth that ate the real story of jazz. Here's what Hollywood never told you about Storyville. The popular legend says jazz was born inside that red light district between 1897 and 1917 and scattered nationwide the moment the United States Navy forced it closed. Historians at Tulane University's William Ransom Hogan Jazz Archive, along with Louisiana State University historian Dr. Alicia Long, have documented that early jazz actually developed all across the city, in dance halls and brass bands and lakefront picnics for years before and after Storyville existed. The myth was cemented by a 1947 Hollywood film. Hollywood said jazz was born in a red light district and ended the day it closed. Tulane's own Jazz Archive, which holds Buddy Bolden's actual Bible, says that's a good story and bad history. Coming in at number 11, the shortcut the government had to undo. The Army Corps of Engineers built a 76-mile shipping channel out of New Orleans in 1965, meant to shave hours off the trip to the Gulf. For decades, it ate away the surrounding wetlands, and engineering investigators, including a University of California at Berkeley team led by Dr. Robert B., identified it afterward as a funnel that amplified the storm surge into St. Bernard Parish during Hurricane Katrina. Congress ordered it deauthorized and closed in 2008. The government built a shortcut for ships. It took a hurricane to learn the shortcut also worked for the storm. The channel is closed now. The wetlands it erased are not coming back. At number 10, the men who marched on New Orleans and never made it. On the night of January 8, 1811, somewhere between 200 and 500 enslaved men and women, led by a man named Charles Deslandes, launched the largest slave uprising in United States history along the German coast of the Mississippi River, marching roughly 30 to 40 miles toward the city. Militia ended the lives of dozens in the field. Tribunals at Destrahan Plantation took the lives of at least 95 more in the days after, according to records held by Destrahan Plantation and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. The heads of those who had been put to death were mounted on poles along more than 30 miles of riverfront, nearly the entire route the rebels had marched, turning the road into the city into the punishment for trying to reach it. This channel is about to show you New Orleans doing something close to this again, 80 years later, solving a problem by making an example of people who had nothing to do with causing it. Stay until the end. Fact 9. The battalion Hollywood leaves out. At the Battle of New Orleans, fought January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson's forces included the Battalion of Free Men of Color, several hundred free black soldiers fighting under his command, alongside privateers led by Jean Lafitte, according to the Louisiana State Museum and the National Park Service's Chalmette battlefield. The battle was fought after the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed on December 24, 1814, but before word of it reached Louisiana. Hollywood gives the Battle of New Orleans to one general on a horse. The National Park Service's own battlefield gives credit to a battalion most people have never heard of. Coming in at number 8, the woman Hollywood turned into a movie witch. Marie Laveau, fictionalized endlessly in film and television as a sorceress, was a documented free woman of color and a devout Catholic in 19th century New Orleans, confirmed by Sacramento records held at the New Orleans Public Library and the historic New Orleans Collection. Stanford University historian Catherine Oliverius, in her book Necropolis, cites contemporary press accounts describing a committee of frightened citizens formally asking Laveau, in writing, to help nurse the sick during the worst epidemic in the city's history. She accepted. Hollywood made her a horror character. The Record made her one of the only people this city trusted in its darkest hour. Her tomb in St. Louis, Cemetery No. 1, is still one of the most visited grave sites in the country, and it is now protected and monitored around the clock. Landing at number 7, the summer that earned the city a new name. In the summer of 1853, yellow fever claimed at least 7,849 documented lives in New Orleans, a city of roughly 150,000, according to the city's own Sanitary Commission report of 1854. On the single worst day, August 20th, 300 lives were lost. Between 1817 and the start of the Civil War, the disease is estimated to have claimed as many as 150,000 lives in the city, earning it the nickname Necropolis, a name that literally means City of the Departed. That's more documented loss in one summer than in most Civil War battles, from a disease nobody in the city understood, in a city most people only associate with hurricanes. Remember the woman from the last fact? This is the disaster she was asked to help fight. At number 6, the report the government wrote blaming itself. When Hurricane Katrina struck on August 29, 2005, more than 50 levees and flood walls failed around New Orleans, flooding roughly 80% of the city. In June 2006, the Army Corps of Engineers released a report exceeding 6,000 pages taking responsibility, attributing the failures to outdated data and disjointed engineering, not simply a storm too strong to withstand. The American Society of Civil Engineers called it the worst engineering catastrophe in United States history. More than 1,390 lives were lost in Louisiana alone. Most people think a hurricane flooded New Orleans. The agency that built the walls wrote 6,000 pages admitting it was their failure first. Coming in at number 5, the levee New Orleans blew up on purpose. During the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, with the city's financial district at risk, bankers and business leaders pressed Governor Ormel Simpson to authorize dynamiting the levee at Caernarvon, 13 miles downriver. On April 29, 1927, engineers set off roughly 39 tons of dynamite, releasing 250,000 cubic feet of water per second into St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes, displacing about 10,000 people, according to the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and the Times-Picayune's own historical archive. Most residents were never fully compensated. The blast turned out to be unnecessary. Levees upstream had already begun to break on their own. New Orleans didn't just survive the flood of 1927. It decided, in a closed-door meeting of bankers, who would absorb the disaster instead. Stick around, because the city had perfected this by then, solving a crisis by making sure the cost landed on somebody who couldn't fight back in court. You're about to meet 11 men who paid the highest price of all for a crime they may not have committed. Fact 4, Little Palermo. By the 1880s, New Orleans held the largest Italian immigrant population of any city in the American South, nearly 300,000 arrivals between 1884 and 1924, most of them Sicilian, earning part of the French Quarter the nickname Little Palermo, according to immigration records cited by the Library of Congress. Before there was a French Quarter or a Spanish Quarter in anybody's memory, There was little Palermo, and almost nobody remembers it existed. This is the community at the center of the story I've been promising you. What happened to 11 of its men in March of 1891 is still, by official measure, the largest mass lynching in American history. Here is exactly how it happened. At number 3, the police chief who named his attackers and was wrong. On the night of October 15, 1890, New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy was struck by gunfire multiple times near his home and did not survive the next morning. According to widely repeated, disputed accounts, he used a slur for Italians when asked who was responsible. In the weeks after, police rounded up hundreds of Italian immigrants. 19 men were eventually indicted, including a boy of 14. No physical evidence ever conclusively tied any of them to the crime, and the person actually responsible for Hennessy's death has never been identified, then or since. New Orleans was certain it knew who was responsible for its police chief's death. New Orleans was wrong and never figured out who actually was. Coming in at number 2, the verdict the city refused to accept. On March 13, 1891, a jury acquitted 6 of the indicted men and declared a mistrial for 3 others, finding no credible evidence against any of them. Furious, a group calling itself the Committee of 50, made up of prominent lawyers, doctors, and merchants, organized a mass meeting the next morning at the Henry Clay statue on Canal Street, drawing a crowd that newspapers put at 8,000 or more. A jury's verdict took an afternoon. Undoing it took less than a day, and the men who organized that didn't have to hide their names, because what they did next, they did in daylight, in front of a crowd that came ready to. And finally, number 1, the largest lynching in American history, and the apology that took 128 years. The Committee of 50 led that crowd straight to the Orleans Parish Prison. Warden Lemuel Davis refused to open the main gate, so the mob forced its way through a smaller wooden one. Davis hid the 19 indicted men throughout the building. It didn't matter. They were found one by one. Antonio Bagneto, a fruit peddler, did not survive the mob's gunfire, and his body was later strung up on a lamppost while the crowd watched. Antonio Marchesi, also a fruit peddler, lost his life alongside him. His young son, Gaspar, survived only because he hid inside the prison while his father fell feet away. 2 years later, the boy sued the city and won $5,000. Antonio Scafidi, James Caruso, Rocco Geraci, Pietro Monasterio, Loreto Comidis, Emanuele Polizzi, Frank Romero, and Charles Trena lost their lives in that same hour, inside those same walls. Joseph Macheca, a successful fruit importer and one of the wealthier Sicilian-American businessmen in the city, fell with them. 11 men in total. 3 had been formally acquitted the day before. None had been convicted of anything. A grand jury convened 4 days later, headed by Judge Robert Marr, a longtime personal friend of several men in that mob. On May 5, 1891, the jury concluded that the original trial's verdict had likely been secured through bribery. It declined to name a single member of the mob that carried it out. Not one person was ever prosecuted for any of the 11 lives lost. Italy recalled its minister to Washington and severed diplomatic relations with the United States. The following year, the federal government paid Italy roughly $760,000 in today's money without admitting fault, and President Benjamin Harrison held the first National Columbus Day, partly to smooth things over with Italian-American voters. I have read the grand jury's own conclusion, the one that says bribery probably happened and still declines to name a single person responsible in that mob, and I cannot explain how both of those findings came out of the same room. Nobody can. New Orleans Mayor LaToya Cantrell issued the city's first formal apology for the lives lost that night on April 12, 2019, 128 years after the mob marched. The Henry Clay statue that anchored that crowd has since been moved from where it stood that morning. New Orleans never determined who was actually responsible for David Hennessy's death, and it still hasn't told you.